The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and orange as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet inside the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II. The massive aircraft, nicknamed the Warthog for its brutal appearance and devastating firepower, sat ready on the tarmac at Bagram Air Base. Sarah had flown dozens of missions over the rugged terrain of Afghanistan, but something about today felt different. 300 miles to the east, a team of 381 Navy SEALs had been inserted into a remote valley for what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission. Their objective was simple: gather intelligence on Taliban movements and weapon caches in the area. The mission planners had assured everyone it would be a quiet operation, lasting no more than 48 hours. Sarah's radio crackled to life as she performed her pre-flight checks. Hawkeye 6, this is Control Tower. You're cleared for Patrol Sector, Charlie 7. Weather looks good, visibility excellent. She acknowledged the transmission and felt the familiar rumble as her engines spun up to full power. Meanwhile, in the mountains, the SEAL team had been moving through the valleys since before dawn. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez led the point team, his eyes constantly scanning the rocky terrain ahead. Behind him, the long column of elite warriors moved like shadows through the morning mist. They had trained for years for missions like this, but the mountains of Afghanistan were unforgiving to even the most experienced soldiers. The first sign of trouble came at 800 hours. Rodriguez spotted movement on a ridgeline about 800 meters to their north. He raised his hand, and the entire column froze instantly. Through his binoculars, he could see figures moving along the mountain paths, but they weren't local farmers or shepherds. These men carried weapons and moved with military precision. Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson, the mission leader, crawled forward to Rodriguez's position. As he studied the enemy movements through his own scope, his heart sank. What they were seeing wasn't a small Taliban patrol or even a medium-sized unit. The entire mountainside seemed to be crawling with enemy fighters. "Sir, we've got company," Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "Looks like at least 200 hostiles on the northern ridge, and I'm seeing more movement to the east and west. They're not just passing through, they're positioning themselves around us." Thompson's mind raced as he processed the information. The intelligence had been wrong, completely wrong. This wasn't a quiet valley with minimal enemy presence. This was a Taliban stronghold, and somehow his team had walked right into the middle of it. Back at Bagram, Sarah was settling into her patrol route when the emergency transmission came through. All aircraft, this is command. We have a situation developing in Sector Delta 5. SEAL Team Bravo is requesting immediate close air support. Multiple enemy contacts, surrounded position. Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew Sector Delta 5 was far from her current position, and according to protocol, she wasn't supposed to leave her assigned patrol area without direct orders. But she also knew that 381 American warriors were in serious trouble, and every second counted. The radio continued to crackle with urgent communications. "Command, this is SEAL Team Bravo Actual. We are taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Enemy strength estimated at over 1,000 fighters. We are surrounded and taking casualties. Request immediate air support, over." Thompson's voice was calm despite the chaos erupting around him. Bullets were already beginning to snap overhead as the Taliban forces closed their trap. His men had taken defensive positions among the rocks and sparse vegetation, but their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and calculated distances in her head. She had enough fuel to reach the SEAL position, but it would mean abandoning her assigned sector and directly disobeying standing orders. Military protocol was clear. Pilots were to remain in their assigned areas unless specifically redirected by command. "Hawkeye 6, maintain your current patrol pattern," came the voice from command. "We are vectoring appropriate assets to assist the ground team." But Sarah knew the math didn't work. The appropriate assets were F-16s based 400 miles away, and by the time they arrived, the SEALs could be overrun. Her A-10 with its heavy armor and devastating 30mm cannon was exactly what the surrounded team needed, and she was only 150 miles away. On the ground, the situation was becoming desperate. The Taliban had used the terrain expertly, positioning fighters on the high ground all around the valley. The SEALs were trapped in a natural bowl with nowhere to run and limited cover. Rodriguez counted muzzle flashes from at least 6 different directions as bullets rained down on their position. "Sir, They're moving in for the final assault, Rodriguez reported to Thompson. I count at least 300 fighters advancing from the north alone. We're about to be completely overrun. Thompson knew his options were limited. They could fight to the last man, but against those odds it would be a massacre. They could try to break out, but the enemy had them completely surrounded with interlocking fields of fire. Their only hope was air support, and it needed to arrive soon. Sarah stared at her radio for a long moment, listening to the increasingly desperate calls from the ground team. She thought about the 381 men who were counting on someone, anyone, to come to their aid. She thought about military protocol and the consequences of disobeying direct orders. Then she thought about what it would feel like to return to base knowing she could have helped save American lives but chose to follow rules instead. The decision, when it came, was instinctive rather than calculated. Sarah banked her A-10 hard to the east and pushed the throttles forward. Command, this is Hawkeye 6. I'm proceeding to assist ground team in Sector Delta 5. Negative. Hawkeye 6. Return to your assigned patrol area immediately. Sarah turned off her radio and flew toward the sound of the guns. Sarah's A-10 screamed across the Afghan landscape at maximum speed, the twin engines pushing the heavily armored aircraft faster than it was ever designed to go. Below her, the barren mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks shrouded in morning haze. Every minute felt like an hour as she calculated and recalculated her arrival time at the SEAL position. Her radio had been silent since she'd switched it off, but she knew the consequences of her decision were already building back at command. Officers would be scrambling to figure out why one of their pilots had gone rogue. Her career was probably over before she even reached the battlefield. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was getting to those men before it was too late. In the valley where the SEALs were trapped, the situation had gone from bad to catastrophic. The Taliban fighters had completed their encirclement and were now closing in from all sides. Lieutenant Commander Thompson could hear the enemy commanders shouting orders in Pashto as they coordinated their final assault. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been hit twice, once in the shoulder and once in the leg, but he continued to return fire with deadly accuracy. Around him, the other SEALs fought with the desperate intensity of men who knew they were facing overwhelming odds. The rocky ground was already stained with blood from both sides, but the Americans were vastly outnumbered. "Sir, ammunition's running low," called out Petty Officer Williams from behind a boulder about 20 meters to Thompson's right. "I've got maybe 2 magazines left." Similar reports were coming in from positions all around their defensive perimeter. They had started the mission with a standard combat load, but they had never expected to fight a pitched battle against an entire Taliban regiment. Thompson checked his watch. It had been 45 minutes since they'd first requested air support. In normal circumstances, fast-moving jets should have been overhead within 30 minutes, but these weren't normal circumstances. The nearest F-16s were still hours away, and the Apache helicopters at the forward operating base didn't have the range to reach their position. "Command, this is SEAL Team Bravo," Thompson transmitted desperately. "We are being overrun. Casualties are mounting. Where is our air support?" The response was static and broken fragments of transmission. Either their radio was damaged, or they were too far from the relay stations to maintain clear communications. Above the battlefield, Sarah was pushing her A-10 to its absolute limits. The aircraft wasn't built for speed like the sleek F-16s or F-18s, but it was built for one thing: destroying enemy ground forces. The massive 30mm GAU-8 cannon mounted in the nose could fire depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. When that cannon spoke, enemy forces listened. She was still 50 miles out when she first heard the garbled transmissions from the ground team. Her radio was back on now, tuned to the emergency frequency. The voices were tense, professional, but she could hear the underlying desperation. These were America's elite warriors, men who had fought in the worst places on Earth, and they were scared. Any aircraft. "This is SEAL Team Bravo. We are taking heavy casualties and are nearly out of ammunition. Enemy forces are within 100 meters of our position. We need immediate close air support or we will be overrun." Sarah checked her weapon systems one more time. She was carrying a full load of 30mm ammunition, plus 4 AGM-65 Maverick missiles and 2 500-pound bombs. It was enough firepower to level a city block, but she would have to use it precisely. The enemy forces were dangerously close to the American positions, and one mistake could kill the very men she was trying to save. On the ground, the final Taliban assault had begun. Hundreds of fighters were advancing up the valley floor while others provided covering fire from the ridgelines above. The SEALs could hear the enemy battle, cries getting closer and closer as their defensive perimeter continued to shrink. Rodriguez had dragged himself to a new firing position after his last one became untenable. Blood loss was making him dizzy, but his aim was still true. Every shot had to count now because every bullet might be one of his last. "Sir, they're 50 meters out on the north side," he reported to Thompson. "I can see them moving between the rocks." Thompson was down to his last magazine when he heard something that made his heart leap. It was faint at first, almost lost in the noise of battle, but gradually it became unmistakable. The sound of jet engines coming fast and low. "Do you hear that?" He called out to his men. "Air support is inbound." The Taliban fighters had heard it too. Some of them began looking nervously at the sky, but their commanders drove them forward. They were so close to victory now, so close to wiping out an entire American unit. A few more minutes and it would all be over. Sarah crested the last mountain ridge and saw the battlefield spread out below her. The scene was worse than she had imagined. The valley floor was covered with muzzle flashes as hundreds of Taliban fighters closed in on a small cluster of rocks, where the Americans had made their last stand. She could see tracer rounds crisscrossing the air like deadly fireworks. "SEAL Team Bravo, this is Hawkeye 6. I'm an A-10 pilot inbound on your position. I need you to mark your location immediately." Thompson's voice came back instantly, filled with relief and desperation. "Hawkeye 6, thank God you're here. We're marked with infrared strobes. Enemy forces are advancing from all directions. Danger close on all sides." Sarah switched to her infrared display and immediately spotted the tiny blinking lights that marked the American positions. The friendly forces were completely surrounded, with enemy fighters closing in from every direction. Some Taliban fighters were already within 30 meters of the SEAL perimeter. This was the most dangerous type of close air support mission possible. The margin for error was measured in meters, not hundreds of meters. One slight miscalculation, one small mistake in targeting, and she would kill the very men she had come to save. But there was no choice now. The SEALs were seconds away from being overrun. Sarah armed her 30mm cannon and began her attack run. Below her, 381 American warriors waited to see if salvation had finally arrived, or if they were about to witness their own rescue mission become their funeral pyre. The first pass would determine everything. Sarah took a deep breath, steadied her aircraft, and dove toward the enemy forces with her finger on the trigger. In the next 30 seconds, she would either save 381 lives or accidentally end them. There was no middle ground, no room for hesitation, and no second chances. Sarah's A-10 dove toward the battlefield like a hawk stooping on its prey. The heavily armored aircraft shuddered as she pushed it through the thin mountain air. Her eyes locked on the infrared display showing the tiny blinking strobes that marked the American positions. Around those strobes, hundreds of heat signatures moved like ants swarming toward sugar. She had seconds to make her first pass count. The Taliban fighters advancing from the north were closest to overrunning the SEAL position, with some already within 25 meters of the Americans. Sarah selected her 30mm cannon and lined up her attack run, her hand steady despite the enormous pressure of the moment. "SEAL Team Bravo, this is Hawkeye 6. Danger close gun run inbound from the north. Keep your heads down." Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice crackled back immediately. "Copy, Hawkeye 6. We're as low as we can get. Light them up." Below, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez heard the roar of the approaching A-10 and felt a surge of hope despite his wounds. He had called in close air support dozens of times during his career, but never in a situation this desperate. The enemy fighters were so close he could see their faces, could hear their individual voices as they called out to each other. Sarah's targeting computer locked onto the advancing Taliban fighters. The 30mm GIU-8 cannon was one of the most devastating weapons ever mounted on an aircraft. Each depleted uranium round was the size of a beer bottle and could penetrate tank armor. Against human targets, the effect was devastating. She squeezed the trigger. The sound was unlike anything the SEALs had ever heard. The GIU-8 cannon fired at such a high rate that individual shots blended into a continuous buzzing roar, like a giant chainsaw tearing through the mountains. The muzzle flash lit up the nose of the A-10 like a strobe light as hundreds of rounds streamed toward the ground. The effect on the Taliban fighters was immediate and catastrophic. The depleted uranium rounds tore through their ranks like an invisible scythe, sending up geysers of rock and dust as they impacted the mountainside. Men who had been advancing confidently just seconds before simply vanished in the maelstrom of destruction. Rodriguez watched in amazement as the enemy fighters who had been about to overrun his position were swept away by the devastating fire. Bodies tumbled down the rocky slope as the survivors scrambled for whatever cover they could find. The immediate threat to the north side of the perimeter had been eliminated in less than 10 seconds. But Sarah's work was just beginning. As she pulled out of her first attack run, she could see Taliban fighters regrouping on the other sides of the valley. The northern group had been decimated, but hundreds of enemy fighters remained, and they were already adapting to the new threat from above. SEAL Team Bravo, northern threat neutralized. I'm coming around for the east side. How's your ammunition situation? Thompson's response was grim but determined. Hawkeye 6, we're down to our last few magazines. Whatever you're going to do it fast. They're still pressing hard from the east and west. Sarah banked the A-10 into a steep turn, fighting against the G-forces that tried to push her down into her seat. The aircraft wasn't designed for aerobatic maneuvers, but it was built to take punishment and keep flying. She could already see muzzle flashes from the eastern ridge as Taliban fighters tried to suppress the SEAL positions with heavy machine gun fire. On the ground, the brief respite from the north had allowed some of the SEALs to reposition and redistribute ammunition. Petty Officer Williams crawled from his position to where Rodriguez lay bleeding behind a boulder. How you holding up, Sergeant? Rodriguez managed a weak grin despite his pain. Been better, but I've got at least one more magazine in me. That A-10 pilot just bought us some time, but we're still outnumbered about 4-1. Williams pressed field dressings against Rodriguez's wounds, while keeping one eye on the eastern ridge. Well, at least now we've got someone watching our backs from upstairs. That cannon is something else. Sarah was lining up her second attack run when she spotted a new threat. Through her targeting system, she could see Taliban fighters setting up what looked like anti-aircraft weapons on the western ridge. The mountainous terrain provided perfect concealment for surface-to-air missiles, and she knew that once those weapons were operational, her ability to help the SEALs would be severely limited. She had to make a choice: continue with her planned attack on the eastern positions, or divert to neutralize the anti-aircraft threat. Both targets were dangerous to the Americans below, but the SAM sites would eventually make it impossible for her to provide any support at all. SEAL Team Bravo, I've got eyes on possible SAM sites on the western ridge. I need to take those out before they get operational. Can you hold for another 2 minutes? Thompson's response came back immediately. Negative, Hawkeye 6. We're about to be overrun from the east. We need fire support now or we're done. Sarah found herself facing the classic dilemma of close air support. Too many targets, not enough time. She could see Taliban fighters advancing down the eastern slope, now within 40 meters of the American positions. But she could also see the telltale signatures of missile systems being assembled on the western ridge. The decision came to her in an instant of clarity. She armed one of her AGM-65 Maverick missiles and locked onto the largest heat signature on the western ridge. The missile would have to do the work against the SAM sites while she used her cannon against the eastern advance. SEAL Team Bravo, missile inbound on western ridge, then gun run on eastern positions. 30 seconds. She fired the Maverick and immediately banked toward the eastern slope. Behind her, the missile streaked toward its target. Its guidance system locked onto the heat signature of the Taliban weapon system. The explosion when it hit was visible even in daylight, sending a column of black smoke rising from the western ridge. But there was no time to admire her handiwork. The eastern slope was alive with muzzle flashes as Taliban fighters poured automatic weapons fire down toward the trapped SEALs. Sarah could see tracers streaming through the air like deadly meteors, some passing dangerously close to the American positions. She lined up her second strafing run, this one even more dangerous than the first. The enemy fighters on the eastern slope were using the terrain more effectively, hiding behind rocks and in small caves. Some were so close to the SEAL positions that the margin for error was measured in just a few meters. Rodriguez looked up as he heard the A-10 approaching for its second run. Through the haze of gun smoke and dust, he could see Taliban fighters moving between the rocks above him, getting ready for what might be their final assault. His rifle was down to its last few rounds and his vision was starting to blur from blood loss. Sarah took a deep breath and began her second attack run. This time the enemy was ready for her. As she dove toward the eastern slope, green tracers began reaching up toward her aircraft. The Taliban fighters had learned from her first pass and were now actively trying to shoot her down. The A-10's armored cockpit was designed to protect against exactly this kind of fire. But Sarah could hear the metallic pings as bullets struck her aircraft. Warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel, but the tough old Warthog kept flying. She opened fire with the 30mm cannon again, walking the devastating stream of fire across the eastern slope. Rock formations exploded as the depleted uranium rounds found their targets, and Taliban fighters who had been confident in their rocky hiding places suddenly found themselves exposed to the fury from above. The second pass was as effective as the first. Enemy fighters on the eastern slope were either killed outright or forced to retreat to deeper cover. The immediate pressure on the SEAL positions was relieved, but Sarah knew this was far from over. As she climbed away from her second attack run, Sarah could see more Taliban fighters moving through the valleys to the south. This wasn't just a regiment, it was an entire enemy division, and they were all converging on the trapped American unit. She had bought the SEALs some breathing room, but the battle was far from won. Sarah climbed her battered A-10 to higher altitude and assessed the damage from the ground fire. Several warning lights glowed amber on her instrument panel, and she could feel a slight vibration in the left engine that hadn't been there before. But the tough aircraft was still flying, still fighting, and that's all that mattered. Below her, the battlefield had temporarily quieted after her devastating gun runs, but she could see through her targeting system that this was just a brief pause. Taliban reinforcements were streaming into the valley from multiple directions, and what had started as a large enemy force was becoming a massive one. Her radio crackled with intercepted Taliban communications, translated in real time by intelligence assets monitoring the frequencies. Multiple enemy units converging on target location, came the voice of an intelligence analyst. Estimated enemy strength now over 1,500 fighters. Additional heavy weapons detected moving into position. Sarah felt her heart sink as she processed this information. She had helped the SEALs survive the initial assault, but the enemy force was growing larger by the minute. Her A-10 carried tremendous firepower, but even she couldn't take on an entire Taliban division by herself. On the ground, Lieutenant Commander Thompson was using the temporary lull to reorganize his men and assess their situation. The good news was that Sarah's attacks had broken up the immediate enemy assault and given them breathing room. The bad news was that they were still surrounded, still low on ammunition, and now facing an even larger enemy force. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been moved to the center of their defensive perimeter, where the team medic was working to stabilize his wounds. Despite the pain and blood loss, Rodriguez remained alert and continued to provide tactical advice to his teammates. "Sir, I'm counting movement in at least 6 different valleys now," he reported to Thompson. "They're not just trying to overrun us anymore. They're trying to build a wall around us that nothing can break through." Thompson nodded grimly as he studied the terrain through his binoculars. The Taliban commanders had clearly decided that capturing or killing an entire SEAL team was worth committing significant resources. This was no longer just a tactical engagement. It was becoming a strategic battle that could influence the entire war in Afghanistan. "Hawkeye 6, this is SEAL Team Bravo," Thompson transmitted. "Outstanding work on those gun runs. What's your fuel and ammunition status?" Sarah checked her gauges before responding. "SEAL Team Bravo, I've got about 40 minutes of fuel remaining and 60% cannon ammunition. 2 Mavericks and 2 500-pound bombs still available, but I'm tracking massive enemy reinforcements moving into your area. This is becoming something bigger than what one aircraft can handle." Even as she spoke, Sarah could see the truth of her words playing out below. Taliban fighters were taking positions on ridgelines that hadn't been occupied before. Heavy weapons teams were setting up mortars and anti-aircraft guns in prepared positions. This wasn't a hasty response to an unexpected encounter. It was a planned operation to eliminate the American force. Thompson's response was characteristic of the man and his training: calm, professional, and determined. "Copy, Hawkeye 6, we understand the situation. Just keep doing what you're doing." "We're not planning on going anywhere." But privately, Thompson was running calculations that didn't look good. His team had started the mission with 381 men, but they had already taken casualties during the initial assault. They were down to maybe 350 effective fighters, and their ammunition situation was critical. Most of his men were down to their last few magazines and resupply was impossible as long as they remained surrounded. Sarah was facing her own critical decision. Her fuel situation meant she could continue to provide close air support for maybe another 30 minutes before she would be forced to return to base. But she also knew that help was finally on the way. F-16s from Bagram were now airborne and heading toward the battlefield, though they were still 90 minutes out. Apache attack helicopters were also en route, but they were even further away. The question was whether the SEALs could hold out until reinforcements arrived. Sarah studied the tactical display on her screen, watching as red symbols representing enemy forces continued to multiply around the blue symbol marking the American position. It looked like a cancer spreading through the mountains. Her decision was interrupted by urgent radio calls from the ground. "Hawkeye 6, we've got mortars incoming." Thompson's voice was sharp with alarm. "Large enemy force advancing from the south. We need immediate fire support." Sarah looked down at the southern approach to the valley and felt her blood run cold. A massive column of Taliban fighters was moving up the valley floor, at least 400 strong, supported by mortars and heavy machine guns. This wasn't just another probe or assault. This was the main attack designed to finish off the surrounded Americans. She armed her remaining weapons and began her attack run. But even as she did so, she knew it wasn't going to be enough. There were simply too many enemy fighters spread across too wide an area. Her 30mm cannon was devastating, but it could only target one small area at a time. The first mortar rounds began exploding around the SEAL positions as Sarah dove toward the southern column. The Taliban had learned from her earlier attacks and were now coordinating their assault with indirect fire support. Explosions erupted among the rocks where the Americans had taken cover, sending shrapnel whining through the air. Petty Officer Williams was thrown against a boulder by a nearby explosion, his helmet knocked askew and his ears ringing. Blood trickled from a dozen small cuts where rock fragments had found gaps in his protective gear. Around him, other SEALs were calling out target information and ammunition status reports, their voices barely audible over the noise of exploding mortars. Sarah opened fire with her 30mm cannon, walking the stream of depleted uranium rounds through the advancing Taliban column. The effect was immediate and devastating, as entire sections of the enemy formation simply disappeared under the withering fire. But for every fighter that fell, two more seemed to take his place. She fired one of her 500-pound bombs into the densest concentration of enemy forces, and the massive explosion sent a mushroom cloud of dust and debris hundreds of feet into the air. When the smoke cleared, a crater marked where dozens of Taliban fighters had been standing just seconds before. But it still wasn't enough. The southern attack was just one prong of a coordinated assault that was now developing from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah could see enemy forces moving to attack from the west, east, and north as well. The Taliban commanders had committed everything to this assault, determined to overwhelm the Americans through sheer numbers. SEAL Team Bravo, I count enemy attacks developing from 4 directions simultaneously. I'm engaging the southern column, but you've got company coming from everywhere. Thompson's response was grim but steady. Copy, Hawkeye 6. We see them. Just keep hitting whatever looks like the biggest threat. As Sarah climbed away from her attack run, she realized that both she and the SEALs were now fighting against time as much as against the enemy. Her fuel was running critically low, the enemy forces were growing stronger, and the cavalry wasn't going to arrive for at least another hour. The next few minutes would determine whether 350 American warriors would live to see another sunset, or whether they would make their last stand in a remote Afghan valley, thousands of miles from home. Sarah's fuel gauge showed 15 minutes of flying time remaining as she banked the A-10 for what might be her final attack run. Below her, the situation had deteriorated into a nightmare scenario that would test every skill she had learned in years of combat flying. Taliban forces were now attacking the SEAL position from all 4 cardinal directions simultaneously, with mortar fire raining down from hidden positions in the surrounding mountains. The mathematics of the battle were simple and terrifying. Roughly 300 remaining SEALs, most down to their last few rounds of ammunition, were facing over 2,500 Taliban fighters supported by heavy weapons. Without immediate and overwhelming air support, the outcome was inevitable. Lieutenant Commander Thompson had consolidated his men into the tightest possible defensive perimeter, but enemy forces were now within 20 meters on multiple sides. The rocky terrain that had provided some protection was now becoming a liability, as Taliban fighters were able to use the same boulders and crevices for concealment as they closed in. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, despite his wounds, had managed to drag himself to a position where he could see the southern approach. Through his rifle scope, he could count individual enemy fighters moving between the rocks, getting ready for what was clearly going to be a final assault. "Sir, they're massing for one big push," he reported to Thompson. "I count at least 200 coming from the south alone." Thompson acknowledged the report while he calculated distances and angles. His men were professionals, the best trained warriors in the world, but training could only do so much when facing overwhelming odds. "All positions prepare for final defensive fire. Make every shot count." Sarah could see the developing situation clearly through her targeting systems. The Taliban forces were coordinating their assault with military precision, waiting until all units were in position before launching their overwhelming attack. She had maybe one more chance to disrupt their plans before her fuel forced her to leave the battlefield. She armed her last 500-pound bomb and selected the largest concentration of enemy forces she could identify. The weapon would be devastating, but it could only target one small area of the battlefield. After that, she would be down to her 30mm cannon and whatever ammunition remained. "SEAL Team Bravo, this is Hawkeye 6. I'm down to my last bomb and about 10 minutes of fuel. I'm going to hit the southern concentration, then make gun runs until I have to leave. After that, you're going to be on your own until the F-16s arrive." Thompson's response was characteristically calm despite the desperate circumstances. "Copy. Hawkeye 6, understood. You've already done more than anyone could ask. We'll hold the line." Sarah began her attack run, diving the heavily armored A-10 through increasing anti-aircraft fire. The Taliban had learned from her previous attacks and were now actively hunting her aircraft with everything from AK-47s to heavy machine guns. Green tracers reached up toward her like deadly fingers, and she could hear the metallic impacts as bullets struck her armored cockpit. More warning lights illuminated her instrument panel, and the vibration in her left engine was getting worse. But the tough A-10 kept flying, kept fighting, just like the men on the ground below who were refusing to give up despite impossible odds. She released her last bomb into the heart of the southern Taliban concentration. The massive explosion lit up the valley like a miniature sun, sending shock waves rolling across the mountainside. When the smoke cleared, dozens of enemy fighters had been eliminated, but Sarah could see more taking their places almost immediately. On the ground, the SEALs used the temporary disruption caused by the bombing to adjust their positions and redistribute their remaining ammunition, but the math remained unchanged. Too many enemies, too little ammunition, too little time before the final assault. Petty Officer Williams had taken shrapnel in his left arm from a mortar fragment, but he continued to fire his rifle with mechanical precision. Each shot was carefully aimed, each trigger pull calculated to have maximum effect. Like all of his teammates, he was making every bullet count because there weren't many left. Sarah began a series of strafing runs with her 30mm cannon, hitting enemy concentrations wherever she could find them. But for every Taliban fighter that fell, more seemed to emerge from hidden positions in the rocks. It was like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. Her fuel gauge dropped below 10 minutes as she climbed away from her latest gun run. The warning light for her left engine had gone from amber to red, and she could see smoke trailing from that side of her aircraft. The A-10 was dying around her, but it was still flying, still fighting. "Command, this is Hawkeye 6, she transmitted on her command frequency. "I am critically low on fuel and have taken significant battle damage. SEAL Team Bravo is about to be overrun. What's the status on additional air support?" The response was not what she wanted to hear. "Hawkeye 6 F-16 flight is still 45 minutes out. No other assets available in your area. You are ordered to return to base immediately for fuel and repairs." 45 minutes. Sarah looked down at the battlefield where muzzle flashes were increasing as the final Taliban assault began to develop. The SEALs wouldn't last 45 minutes against what was coming. They might not last 5 minutes. Below her, Thompson was coordinating the final defense of his position. Enemy fire was so intense now that moving between positions required crawling on hands and knees. The air was filled with the crack of passing bullets and the whistle of mortar fragments. All stations, this is Bravo Actual," Thompson transmitted to his men. "Enemy assault is imminent. We've done our duty. We've fought with honor. Whatever happens next, remember that we are United States Navy SEALs. We do not surrender, we do not quit, and we do not leave our brothers behind. Rodriguez managed a weak laugh despite his pain and exhaustion. Hua, sir. These bastards picked the wrong guys to mess with. Sarah stared at her fuel gauge, then at the tactical display showing the desperate situation below. She had a choice. Follow orders and return to base, leaving the SEALs to face certain death, or stay and fight until her aircraft literally fell from the sky. The decision, when it came, surprised even her with its simplicity. She turned off her radio, armed the last of her 30mm ammunition, and began another attack run. If the SEALs were going to make their last stand in this remote valley, they wouldn't be making it alone. Her left engine finally gave out completely as she lined up her attack, but the A-10 was designed to fly on one engine. She adjusted her approach and opened fire with the devastating cannon one more time, sending streams of depleted uranium rounds into the advancing Taliban forces. Below her, 300 American warriors prepared to fight to the last man, while above them, one female pilot had chosen to share their fate rather than abandon them to face it alone. Sarah's A-10 limped through the sky on one engine, black smoke trailing behind her damaged aircraft like a funeral shroud. Her fuel gauge had passed the point of no return 5 minutes ago, but she continued her attack runs with methodical determination. Every round she fired was one less enemy fighter that the SEALs would have to face in their final moments. Below, the Taliban assault was reaching its crescendo. Enemy fighters were now within 10 meters of the American positions on multiple sides, close enough that the SEALs could see individual faces and hear shouted commands. Lieutenant Commander Thompson had pulled his men into the tightest possible defensive circle, with the wounded in the center and every able-bodied fighter facing outward. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, propped against a boulder with field dressings covering his wounds, had switched to his sidearm after exhausting his rifle ammunition. Around him, other SEALs were in similar situations, down to their last few rounds and preparing for hand-to-hand combat. The professional calm that had characterized their radio communications throughout the battle was beginning to crack as the reality of their situation set in. "Sir, they're 20 meters out on the north side," reported Petty Officer Williams, his voice tight with exhaustion and tension. "I can see their eyes." Thompson nodded grimly as he took careful aim with his own rifle. He had 4 rounds left and he intended to make them count. "All positions, prepare for close combat. Remember your training, watch your sectors, and keep fighting until the last man." Sarah could see the developing situation clearly through her targeting system, even as her aircraft continued to deteriorate around her. Warning lights covered her instrument panel like Christmas decorations, and the smell of burning hydraulic fluid was filling her cockpit. She had maybe 2 minutes of ammunition left for the 30mm cannon, and then she would be down to nothing but the weight of her aircraft itself. She lined up what she knew would be her final gun run, targeting the largest concentration of Taliban fighters she could identify. The cannon roared one last time, sending its devastating stream of depleted uranium rounds into the advancing enemy forces. Men who had been moving confidently toward the American position suddenly found themselves in the path of mechanical death. But even as she watched enemy fighters fall under her fire, Sarah could see that it wouldn't be enough. There were simply too many of them, and they were too close to the SEAL positions. Her ammunition counter showed 0 rounds remaining, and her fuel gauge was now flashing red warning lights. It was then that she heard the sound that changed everything, the roar of jet engines. Multiple aircraft coming fast from the east. Sarah looked at her radar display and felt her heart leap as she saw the distinctive signatures of 4 F-16 Fighting Falcons approaching at maximum speed. The cavalry had finally arrived 40 minutes earlier than expected. "Hawkeye 6, this is Viper Flight. We see you down there smoking like a chimney. What's your status?" Sarah's voice was hoarse with exhaustion and emotion as she responded. "Viper Flight, I am out of ammunition and critically low on fuel. SEAL Team Bravo is surrounded and about to be overrun. Recommend immediate danger close strikes on all approaches to their position." The lead F-16 pilot's voice was crisp and professional. "Copy, Hawkeye 6. We see the situation. Get clear of the area and head for base. We'll take it from here." But Sarah wasn't done yet. Even with no ammunition and almost no fuel, she could still serve as a forward air controller, directing the F-16s to the most critical targets. "Negative, Viper Flight. I'm staying to provide target designation. SEAL positions are marked with IR strobes. Enemy forces danger close on all sides." Below, Thompson heard the sound of approaching jets and felt a surge of hope that he had thought was lost forever. All positions, friendly air support inbound. Keep your heads down and mark your positions. The F-16s arrived like avenging angels, their sleek forms cutting through the mountain air at supersonic speed. The lead aircraft immediately locked onto the largest concentration of Taliban fighters and released a 500-pound GPS-guided bomb. The explosion was tremendous, sending shock waves rolling across the valley and causing an avalanche on one of the nearby slopes. The effect on the Taliban forces was immediate and devastating. Men who had been advancing confidently toward what they thought would be an easy victory suddenly found themselves under attack by some of the most sophisticated warplanes in the world. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage, as enemy fighters began to break and run for whatever cover they could find. Sarah, flying on fumes and one engine, continued to circle the battlefield and provide target information to the F-16s. Viper 2, large enemy concentration in the rocks 200 meters north of the SEAL position. Viper 3, I see heavy weapons teams on the western ridge. The F-16s responded with clinical precision, their advanced targeting systems and guided weapons eliminating enemy positions with surgical accuracy. Within minutes, the overwhelming Taliban assault had been broken up into scattered groups of fighters, seeking only to escape the devastating air attacks. Rodriguez looked up from his position as the sound of explosions echoed through the valley. For the first time in hours, the incoming fire directed at their position was diminishing instead of increasing. "Sir, I think the tide just turned," he said to Thompson with a weak but genuine smile. Thompson nodded as he watched Taliban fighters retreating from positions they had been advancing from just minutes before. The immediate crisis was over, but he knew they weren't safe yet. All positions maintain security. Casualties report to the center of the perimeter. We're not out of this yet, but help has arrived. Sarah's fuel finally reached the point where her engines began to flame out. The tough A-10 was finally giving up after absorbing incredible punishment and flying far longer than should have been possible. Viper flight, this is Hawkeye 6, I'm going down. Engines flamed out, looking for a place to set her down. The lead F-16 pilot's response was immediate. Hawkeye 6, we've got you covered. There's a flat area about 2 miles southeast of the SEAL position. Wind is calm. Should be a good spot for a dead stick landing. Sarah nursed her dying aircraft toward the emergency landing site, using every skill she had learned in years of flying to keep the A-10 airborne just a little longer. Behind her, the F-16s continued their systematic destruction of Taliban forces, ensuring that the immediate threat to the SEAL team was eliminated. As she lined up for her emergency landing, Sarah looked back toward the battlefield where 300 American warriors were finally safe after hours of desperate fighting. She had disobeyed direct orders, risked her career, and very nearly given her life. But those men would be going home to their families. The A-10 touched down hard on the rocky ground, bounced twice, and finally came to rest in a cloud of dust and smoke. Sarah sat in her cockpit for a moment, hands shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, listening to the sound of F-16s overhead, continuing to protect the men she had refused to abandon. She had kept faith with the warrior's code that no one fights alone, and 381 Navy SEALs were alive because one female pilot had chosen courage over caution when it mattered most. The rescue helicopters arrived 3 hours after Sarah's emergency landing, their rotors cutting through the thin mountain air as they approached the battlefield that had nearly become a graveyard for an entire SEAL team. The Taliban forces had completely withdrawn from the area, scattered by the devastating F-16 attacks and unwilling to face continued airstrikes. Sarah sat on a boulder near her crashed A-10, watching the search and rescue teams work. Her aircraft looked like it had been through a meat grinder, with hundreds of bullet holes, one completely destroyed engine, and damage to nearly every major system. That it had flown as long as it did was a testament to the toughness of the aircraft and the skill of its pilot. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was among the first to be evacuated, not because of his wounds, which were minor, but because he needed to coordinate the extraction of his entire team. As his helicopter lifted off from the valley floor, he looked down at the scattered wreckage of Taliban equipment and the crater-marked landscape where the battle had taken place. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was loaded into a medical helicopter, his wounds finally receiving proper treatment after hours of field dressings and determination. As the medics worked on him, He kept asking about the female pilot who had saved their lives. Is she okay? Did she make it down safe? The medics assured him that Captain Mitchell was alive and well, waiting for her own ride home. The final casualty count was sobering but could have been catastrophic. The SEAL team had lost 31 men killed in action and 89 wounded, with most of the casualties occurring during the initial Taliban assault before Sarah's arrival. But 350 American warriors were going home alive, men who would have certainly died without the intervention of one A-10 pilot who chose to disobey orders. As Sarah's rescue helicopter lifted off, she could see the wreckage of her A-10 growing smaller below. The aircraft had served faithfully through countless missions, but this would be its last. She felt a moment of sadness for the loss of the machine that had carried her through so many dangerous moments. But that sadness was overwhelmed by the knowledge of what they had accomplished together. The flight back to Bagram Air Base gave Sarah time to think about what awaited her. She had disobeyed direct orders from command, abandoned her assigned patrol sector, and engaged in unauthorized combat operations. In peacetime, such actions would have resulted in a court-martial and the end of her military career. But these were not peacetime circumstances, and 350 men were alive because of her decisions. The helicopter touched down at Bagram just as the sun was setting behind the Afghan mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Sarah was surprised to see a crowd waiting for her, including senior officers, ground crews, and medical personnel. Word of the rescue had spread throughout the base, and everyone wanted to see the pilot who had saved an entire SEAL team. Among the crowd was General Patricia Hayes, the base commander, who rarely met individual pilots personally. As Sarah stepped down from the helicopter, still wearing her flight suit stained with hydraulic fluid and smoke, the general approached her with an expression that was difficult to read. "Captain Mitchell," General Hayes said in a voice that carried across the flight line, "you are either going to be court-martialed or recommended for the Medal of Honor, possibly both." The investigation into Sarah's actions began immediately, but it was clear from the start that this would not be a typical military inquiry. The testimony of the surviving SEALs was unanimous and powerful. Without Captain Mitchell's intervention, they would all have been killed or captured. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's after-action report was particularly compelling, describing in detail how close his team had come to being overrun before the A-10 arrived. The Taliban had committed over 1,500 fighters to the battle, making it one of the largest enemy operations in that sector of Afghanistan in years. Intelligence analysts later determined that eliminating an entire SEAL team would have been a major propaganda victory for the Taliban and could have changed the dynamics of the war in that region. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing in the rose garden of the White House, wearing her dress blue uniform and trying not to fidget as the President of the United States prepared to place the Medal of Honor around her neck. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as an A-10 pilot in support of combat operations against enemy forces." Among the guests at the ceremony were Lieutenant Commander Thompson, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, and dozens of other SEALs who had flown in from around the world to witness the recognition of the pilot who had saved their lives. Rodriguez, still using a cane but otherwise recovered from his wounds, managed to catch Sarah's attention and gave her a thumbs up and a smile that said everything that needed to be said. In her speech after receiving the medal, Sarah was characteristically modest. "I was just doing my job. Any pilot in my position would have done the same thing. The real heroes are the men who fought on the ground against impossible odds and never gave up." But Lieutenant Commander Thompson had a different perspective, which he shared with reporters after the ceremony. Captain Mitchell had a choice between following orders and saving lives. She chose to save lives, knowing it might cost her career. That's not just courage, that's moral courage, and it's the highest form of heroism. The story of the female A-10 pilot who defied orders to save 381 surrounded SEALs became legend in military circles. Told and retold wherever warriors gathered, it became a case study in military academies about the difference between following orders and doing what's right. Most importantly, it became proof that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest courage is shown not by those who fight, but by those who choose to fight for others when they could safely walk away. Sarah continued her military career, eventually retiring as a brigadier general after 25 years of service. But she always said that everything else she accomplished paled in comparison to that day in Afghanistan, when she chose to dive into hell to pull out angels. And in a quiet cemetery in Arlington National Cemetery, on a simple headstone marking the grave of one of the SEALs who didn't make it home that day, someone had carved a small image of an A-10 Thunderbolt, a permanent reminder of the pilot who made sure their sacrifice was not in vain. The bond forged that day between pilot and ground forces became something more than military camaraderie. It became family. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, the survivors gathered to remember their fallen brothers and to honor the woman who gave them a tomorrow. They call it Sarah Day, and it serves as a reminder that heroes come in all forms and that sometimes one person's courage can change the course of history.